Shalom, welcome back. We are picking up again in this study of the book by George Mendenhall, Ancient Israel's Faith and History. If you are following along in the book, this will be the second half of chapter 2, speaking about the formative period in Israel's history. And today we're going to be looking at the structure and function of the Sinai covenant. If you want a copy of this book in PDF form, there will be a link in the description where you can download it. This is, I think, the fourth video in the series on seeking after Yahweh's righteousness. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the terms of the original Sinai covenant. We are looking at the historical context of things that are said in it. And through the process of this, we're identifying some words or some phrases that are maybe misunderstood, with the purpose of trying to get a more complete picture of what the commandments are and what it is that God desires from us. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is part of the formative period. We discussed this in the introduction to Professor Mendenhall's work, the 5 different phases that a religion goes through. And so the formative period is the period where you have this inspired individual who more or less kind of founds the movement. And so during this formative period, the movement, whether it's early Christianity or whether it's this early faith brought by Moses, or you could even compare it to something like Zoroastrianism or something. But there's a period where this inspired individual founds a religion, and the religion remains largely unchanged, like you're following the original principles of this faith. So this is where we left off in the previous video. It said, in antiquity, the revelation of a new religious insight or system was not described in terms of human inspiration or innovation, but rather as a divine revelation associated with a theophany. So a theophany would be, of course, like an interaction of God with human, whether it's like a vision or an apparition or whatever that type of interaction is. You would call that a theophany. The theophany was the typical motive used to explain the origin of something new and meaningful. But something new can only become meaningful if it is also expressed and described in terms and analogies that are already well known to everyone concerned. And I can tell you from making these videos and speaking about the things of God throughout the years, that can be a challenge. It can be a challenge to take an experience that you've had with God and put it into human words and express that interaction in the same complete understanding as you've experienced it as the receiver. So like the interaction with the Holy Spirit, sometimes it's difficult to fully explain to someone. And once you have that experience over time with the Holy Spirit, you begin to read the writings of the prophets, and you can kind of see that they themselves also sometimes struggle to articulate their own experience. Despite its religious novelty, the Sinai covenant Moses delivered was readily intelligible to these ex-slaves because it employed well-known concepts and images. In this case, concepts and images drawn from the familiar world of late Bronze Age international politics. Naturally, they were adapted so that they now serve religious as opposed to political ends, providing a basis for a community whose cohesion did not require any political enforcement mechanism or monopoly of force. So this is where we left off last time. So now we're going to start looking at the treaty itself, the covenant at Sinai. And we're calling it a treaty because that's essentially what it is. Like any type of treaty is a merger between two people, any type of covenant. So like you have a marriage covenant. It's an agreement between two people to act a certain way and to fulfill certain needs of each other. It's very similar to a treaty. And the Sinai covenant, which is identified in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 with the so-called Ten Commandments. He says so-called because he prefers to refer to them as 10 commitments, because they are not something that's just demanded of someone. It is something that you commit to. So like if you agree to the covenant, then these become commitments that you're making to God, as opposed to something that he just commanded from on high and that you have to do. The so-called Ten Commandments had almost exactly the same structure as late Bronze Age international treaties, which were probably widely known throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world. And the reason they were widely known is because they had to be read in public as part of the terms of the treaty. So if a Hittite king made a treaty with the Amorites, then the treaty had to be read at a regular interval, maybe once a year or once every 3 years. It would have to be read in public, and so the people would be familiar with the structure of a international covenant. Although the treaty structure is best known from the Hittite archives, it clearly did not originate with the Hittites. A copper plate excavated at Biblios, and perhaps dating to the end of the early Bronze Age, was inscribed with the text of a treaty made by Huru Ba'elu, king of Byblos, containing almost all the features of the later Hittite treaties. This treaty structure was likely 1,000 years old by the time of Moses, and was part of the common knowledge of people throughout the region. Because such treaties were required to be read publicly across the realm, sometimes several times a year, their basic structure was probably well known, not only to Moses, but to Syro-Palestinian peoples everywhere. So the reason we're talking a lot about the Hittites is not because this treaty, like he says, originated with the Hittites. It's because the most evidence we have is from the Hittites. We have pieces of evidence from other places, like this one he's mentioning here from Biblios. But as far as volume, the number of intact treaties we have the most that are Hittite or originated. The structure of these treaties has had 6 sections, each of which has a clear parallel in biblical traditions describing the Sinai covenant. So first section was a preamble. It had a historical foundation, a list of stipulations, a list of witnesses, a list of curses and blessings, and implicitly a concluding oath activating the treaty. So the preamble says international treaties before the time of Moses were highly formalized, usually beginning with a preamble identifying the overlord with all his elaborate titles. The purpose of this opening line was to identify the supreme authority with whom the relationship was about to be established. Depending on the treaty, this could be any authority figure, whether King Huru Ba'elu of Biblios, the Hittite Emperor Marcellus, or even the God Yahweh. The preamble of the Sinai covenant is simple. I am Yahweh, your God. Exodus 20, verse 2. The covenant then proceeds to shift the basis of the relationship away from the coercive force and onto mutual interest, hoping to unite the concerns and commitments of the vassal with those of the overlord. Simply put, a covenant brings about a merger. Such written treaties were probably based on earlier oral marriage contracts. The Bible often portrays the covenant relationship between Yahweh and Israel as if it were a marriage. See Hosea chapters 1 through 3. Sometime in the early Bronze Age, or perhaps earlier, the concept of a binding of shared commitments was transferred from the private realm of marriage to the political realm of international treaties. At Mount Sinai, it was transferred from that to the spiritual realm of religious relationship. To some extent, I agree with him, but also to some extent, I disagree with the yellow highlighted line. Like, I don't think that we should view this agreement outside the, I don't believe that the early Israelites had like one category in their mind of international politics and another category of religious relationship. That this covenant with Yahweh was just as real and just as tangible as any other treaty with a great king. And so this understanding of separating religion from the rest of our life is a fairly new concept, and I don't believe that they had that concept in their minds, 4,000 years ago. The norm in the ancient Near East was to depict the relationship between deity and common folk as involving a whole set of intermediaries. But here, the Hebrew God is shown establishing a relationship directly with each person by addressing each individual personally. Thou shalt not. There is no charge here given to any king or social authority. The biblical faith begins with this historically unprecedented charter of autonomous and free individuals. Unprecedented because such individualism elsewhere or at a later time would surely concern and offend the governing authorities. So in other words, the covenant was between God and the individual person, not necessarily God and a nation. So you didn't have a level of priests or kings or any other type of leadership that was in charge of administering the terms of the covenant. It was between God and the people, which is what we see reflected also in the words of Yeshua, that it's not a type of covenant relationship that's administered by priests. It is an individual relationship between us and the Father, like is reflected in Matthew 6:6. But you, when you pray, enter into your inner room, and having shut your door, pray to your Father who's in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. So Yeshua was speaking against this understanding of organized religion and the temple cult that was sacrificing animals. For Yeshua, it was about a relationship directly between you and your Heavenly Father. Historical foundation. The next words in the Sinai covenant are, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Imagine the situation of this heterogeneous collection of individuals now stuck in the howling desert, their future uncertain. Can they even survive in this unfamiliar environment? Should they perhaps now go their separate ways, each family trying to make it on its own? Some might want to return to Egypt. Or should they remain together, and if so, what basis of unity can transcend their differences? What do they really have in common? Who should have authority in this new community, and how should it be exercised? Only the recent past, a miraculous deliverance from slavery, was positive, but the past can be used in all sorts of ways for all sorts of purposes. In the treaty tradition, the past was consistently used to emphasize the benefits that an overlord had already conferred on a vassal. The phrase, who brought you out of the house of bondage, in Exodus 20 verse 2, referred to such a benefit. Objectively speaking, this was one tangible thing the ex-slaves undoubtedly held in common. The foundation of the future, however, is the gratitude for such benefits or blessings received. This gratitude at least ought to shape one's outlook or perspective on life, which in turn might inspire one's future choices and commitments. Gratitude was thus something else they all had in common. The use of the past to stimulate a sense of gratitude is evident in the late Bronze Age international treaties, such as the covenant between the Hittite king Mercilus and Dupi-Teshub, king of Amurru. There are about 30 of these Hittite treaties, in which past history is cited to anchor the vassal's future loyalty more firmly in its gratitude for benefits received. Someone reading selected passages in these treaties and substituting God in place of the name of the Hittite king would think that they were reading excerpts from the Bible. And that is precisely the point. For Hebrews, God was a king. They were his vassals, and he was their Lord. Obligations or stipulations. Loyal gratitude is reflected in the vassal's desire to embrace the principles and values of the overlord who has shown such favor. The Hittite treaties sometimes translate these principles and values into a long list of obligations a grateful vassal should embrace. Many concern the extradition of refugees, attesting to the political validity, widespread social dislocations, and mass movements of people toward the end of the Late Bronze Age. In the Sinai Covenant, the list of stipulations contained 10 items, called the Decalogue, or more popularly, the Ten Commandments. Before examining the final 3 sections of the treaty structure, we should examine the Decalogue in more detail. A point that Professor Mendenhall makes later on is that we shouldn't necessarily even view these stipulations or these obligations as being the complete list of what Yahweh necessarily demanded of us. So he gave us these stipulations in the same way you might have a marriage covenant where a husband or two fiancés, two people preparing to get married, they're discussing the type of marriage that they want, the type of marriage they're going to have. They make agreements to certain stipulations in the marriage. But then it's not necessarily that you're coming up with a list of this is everything that we're going to do, because there's situations that haven't come up that maybe you don't discuss. And so it's about establishing a value system. And so if you look at these different agreements that you might make with a prospective spouse, you're discussing a value system. What kind of value system is our marriage going to be built upon? And so then when you're married and some unforeseen circumstance comes up and one spouse maybe addresses this in a way that falls outside of the value system agreed upon in the marriage, and the other spouse objects to it, spouse one might say something to the effect of, well, we never agreed to this. I never agreed to this. I never said that this is what I was going to do in this situation. And that's not relevant. That's not a relevant argument if it goes outside the value system spoken of in the marriage. So it's not necessarily just a list of, like when you make your marriage vows, that every single vow you make is the only thing that you're held to, in other words. So like if you agree to a Christian, type of marriage, or a marriage that's based upon biblical principles, and then one of the spouses is getting into drug use or something like that, and you're like, hey, wait, this doesn't line up with the values of this marriage that we agreed to, and that person says, well, I never said I would never get involved in drugs. Well, that falls outside of the value system of the marriage. Like if you were talking about having this conservative marriage that's based on biblical principles and that sort of thing, that someone being taking a lot of recreational drugs doesn't fit within those parameters of what one would expect in that type of marriage. It's going outside the value system that you agreed to at the beginning of this union. And so it's the same thing with the Ten Commandments. Like there's probably actions that we could take that would fall outside the value system embodied in the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments is more about a value system, a way of living your life as a servant of Yah. There's nothing particularly profound or original about the actual content of the Decalogue, and some of its commitments strike many people today as somewhat petty or irrelevant. Some of the commandments simply reiterate rather basic social obligations already acknowledged worldwide. The embracing of these so-called commandments by a heterogeneous mix of people suggests that in addition to a shared sense of gratitude for past good fortune, these were the only commitments they held in common or felt they needed to hold in common. Political authorities most of whom were now extremely weakened, if not dead, would certainly have given subjects a longer and more explicit list of do's and don'ts. Voluntary compliance with the basic statements of the Decalogue may well have been regarded as an alternative or even a safeguard against other more coercive forms of social or political control. So what he's saying is these commandments are not really written in the manner you would expect if they were given to people by a human king. They, in some ways, the language used in these commandments are very vague, and in some ways are very universal. Like the top paragraph above, what he's saying is that some of these things that are commanded, maybe they didn't even necessarily need to be commanded. Is what he makes a point of, is that most people agree that it's wrong to murder, or it's wrong to commit adultery, or that sort of thing. And I don't necessarily share that assumption. I think that to a lot of people, people in general tend to justify whatever type of unrighteous behavior they do. So, but in the second paragraph, he's making the point that, again, falls in line with what it was that quote from Benjamin Franklin, that the Constitution, for instance, is only fit for a moral people, but is wholly inadequate for an immoral people. And so it's the same thing with the Ten Commandments. Like, they're designed for a moral people, but if morality is lacking within the population, then that's when more commandments will be added and a more stricter form of control. But if a community, if a nation of people, if they all agree to the commitments outlined in the Ten Commandments, it produces a moral society, and a moral society needs far fewer laws to rule over them. It is therefore ironic that Christians have often used the Decalogue coercively as such an instrument of social control, warning people to be good or else face dire consequences. So, first of all, originally he said Jews and Christians. I edited the text because I've never heard of any Jew trying to encourage people to keep the Ten Commandments. But, so I did, just make a few changes to the words or the phrases that Professor Mendenhall used in this section. But I really don't think that Christians do this either. Like, talking to people about the Ten Commandments is not like, forcing it upon anyone. I think this is an accusation that you hear a lot from activists on college campuses, and that's probably where Professor Mendenhall was getting this, because he was a professor on college campuses. So he heard this fallacious argument that Christians are forcing the Ten Commandments on people, which is ludicrous. The situation is usually more along the lines of atheists, particularly Jewish atheists, attempting to remove the Ten Commandments from society, and then they make false accusations. And the common tactic of any type of abuser, where the abuser always makes the victim out to be the abuser. So this false accusation that Christians are forcing the Ten Commandments on people is really to take away from the fact that it's the atheists who are attempting to forcibly remove any reference to the Ten Commandments. So this is, I would have to strongly disagree with that first sentence up there. I don't think the Decalogue is generally misled. I think Christians typically encourage keeping the Ten Commandments to other Christians, not necessarily to people they just meet on the street and hit them over the head with it or something. This misuse of the Decalogue has been facilitated by a mistaken view that its statements are indeed commandments uttered by a demanding deity, a view that has unfortunately become deeply embodied in the consciousness of Christians, and consequently of much of the world. In Deuteronomy, this text is referred to as the 10 words, understood generally as statements, not specifically as commands. This is reinforced by the fact that, grammatically speaking, The verbs used in the Decalogue are not commands, imperatives, or prohibitives. Instead, they are simple future tense verbs of infinitive forms. No one is commanding anyone here in the Decalogue. The Decalogue is simply lists the basic principles that a Lord, in this case Yahweh, offers for the vassal's endorsement. In other words, a person who values and embraces these is poised to enter a covenant relationship with the one who proclaims them, namely Yahweh. So that's what I was saying, is that these are principles. These are principles of behavior, and someone who embraces these principles, they don't need to bicker over what kind of theft is allowed or what kind of killing is allowed or whatever. All these other little debates we get into, like, what does this mean or what does that mean? The Decalogue thus provides not a prescription against bad conduct, but a description of a religious value system. In this case, the ethical obligations and personal commitments that provide the foundation of any and all human communities. These obligations are stated, not demanded. As an aside, I get asked this question from time to time. I don't get asked it as much as I used to. I used to hear it all the time. Someone would come to me and say, do we have to do this blank? Do we have to be circumcised to be saved? Do we have to be baptized to be saved? Do we have to do this to be saved? Do we have to keep the Sabbath to be saved? And all these questions. Do I have to do this commandment in order to be saved? And so, if you are asking that kind of question, and I've responded to people with this, if you feel the need to ask that question, I would question whether or not you are saved at all. Because if you were, quote, saved, if you were really part of this covenant with Yahweh, you wouldn't need to ask all these questions about, do I have to do this? Do I have to do this to be saved? In other words, you're asking, can I just disobey this command? That's not the mindset of a saved individual. A saved individual will be asking, what can I do to please Yahweh? And they wouldn't be dickering over whether I have to keep this command that I don't want to keep. So you need to have a change of heart before you start asking that kind of question. Do I have to do this to be saved? I don't want to do this. I don't want to keep this command. Do I have to? I mean, that's like this childish view where you're just trying to do the bare minimum to keep from getting grounded or something. Like your dad tells you to be home at 10:30, and you're like, do I have to? If I come in at 10:45, am I going to get grounded? Maybe I could, or what? Like your heart's in the wrong place if you're asking those kind of questions. And man, I had somebody got really mad at me for responding that way. I said, if you're asking this question about whether you have to do this to be saved, you're probably not saved. Man, they get mad. They got offended, get mad about it. But it's like, I'm just being honest. You ask me an honest question, I'm going to reward you with an honest answer. Like, if you have to ask these kind of questions, you're probably not saved. Period. As in any covenant, the commitments must be voluntarily embraced and undertaken freely and gladly in grateful response for the benefits, blessings already received. Technically speaking, at this point in the covenant-making process, no relationship yet exists from which an overlord can boldly issue commands. Here, in the stipulations, the overlord can only state the principles of a central concern for the potential vassal to consider. Vassals must embrace the stipulations for their intrinsic merit alone, not because they are afraid of what will happen to them if they do not. In other words, people must see for themselves that these principles are compelling and good. So, if you're asking, do I have to do this? Then you don't have that mindset. You don't have that mindset of gratitude. You don't have that mindset of wanting to be into this covenant with Yahweh. You have this mindset of just wanting something for yourself. These are therefore not 10 commandments. It would be much more accurate and perhaps much better to think of them as 10 commandments, since Yahweh's rule becomes an effective and tangible reality only when human beings freely embrace them also as their own personal commitments. When humans freely embrace them also as their own personal commitments. In other words, when people act on these commitments, all of which restrict self-interest, the rule of God becomes a tangible reality. And that, in effect, is what Yeshua was speaking about when he kept speaking about the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. When people embrace these commandments and live by them, that is the kingdom of God, because God then becomes your king. Establishing a religious basis, i.e. faith, on which human differences can transcend and community achieved. But the thing is, again, this is kind of his understanding that I would hesitate to agree with fully, because I don't think that him saying establishing a religious basis, I don't think so. I think that the people were viewing this as an actual political basis, that they had an actual covenant with Yahweh, and this was the establishment of their political order. This is not something that they considered a different category of religion, at least from what I can tell. Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who's in heaven. This falls in perfect alignment with what we're talking about here. The will of the Father in heaven would be these values that he embodied in the 10 commandments that were given at Mount Sinai. These statements do not serve the ends of social control as such commandments would in almost all other societies. Instead, these 10 commitments cross-culturally define human integrity, making possible a community based on that integrity. Such religious teachings, such as God says not to steal, usually seem unnecessary or at best supplemental in a society whose cohesion is actually based on something other than integrity, such as nationalism, blood kinship, ethnic homogeny, solidarity of interest, or simply externally imposed force, such as law and order. But the Decalogue insists that these religiously grounded commitments are always the primary and essential control mechanisms making any community possible. In other words, the Decalogue describes Yahweh's will simply as those 10 basic commitments necessary to maintain human community with a minimal of conflict and coercion. So, again, that falls in line with that quote we just read from Yeshua, he who does the will of my Father. The Decalogue describes Yahweh's will simply as those 10 basic commitments. Centuries later, parochializing forces in Israel would append to the Decalogue all sorts of law codes mandating specific cultural norms, creating the impression that Yahweh was overweening in his demands, as concerned with what Israelites ate, how they dressed, as with whether or not they told the truth, stole, cheated, or harmed others. To salvage an emphasis on the latter ethical matters, the early Jewish Christians felt compelled to jettison all emphasis on the former ethical matters. The one thing I would take from this is that, yes, over time, they did add all sorts of law codes. Now, whether Yahweh demanded some of these sideline issues, like what to eat, we have that answered through the early Christians. Yahweh did demand that they abstain from eating the flesh of dead animals. That's attested to in the Clementine writings and the references we have to the gospel according to the Hebrews and such as that. So some of these things I would say he's maybe not quite accurate on, but he's coming from a different understanding on this matter than I am. But some of the other commands were maybe stuff that was added after the fact that didn't necessarily reflect the commandments in the 10 Commandments. And some of them, at times he refers to those additional commands as like case law. So there's a commandment, not to steal. How was the different types of theft addressed in Israelite society, and that would fall more under case law rather than the original commands given by Yahweh. But the way that they're included in the Pentateuch is included in the way as if Yahweh himself had given these more precise stipulations or law code of how to handle these matters. What made these obligations profound and religious as opposed to merely social is that at Sinai they stood not as supplemental commandments alongside other mechanisms of social control, but rather in place of such mechanisms altogether. The existence of community is staked precariously on nothing more than people's commitment to these obligations and to the faith that inspires that commitment. There is no other fail-safe mechanism that can salvage community if that faith and commitment should wane. A sociologically sobering insight. That is what made the Sinai community religiously based as opposed to culturally or politically based. The only homogeny that existed among these people was their shared commitment to a very fundamental definition of human integrity and religious obligation. In other words, their basic value system. The Decalogue thus constituted a religious value system that was genuinely transcendent, in the sense that it actually rose above or superseded existing social and cultural differences. People with a frontier mentality might eagerly embrace something akin to this as a desirable basis for building a new community and a future on the ruins of the discredited past. So, in discussing value systems, it's important to remember that a value is not simply an agreeable idea, but something that actually determines one's commitments, choices, and activities. The Latin word for this was valuta, which corresponds with Anglo-Saxon worthship, the antecedent of our word worship. In this sense, any time a person acts, either on the basis of a commitment or to uphold a value, by definition, that person is engaging in worship. As we saw with Baal and Asherah, so it was with Yahweh. Embracing a value system and worshiping are essentially one and the same thing. The God being worshipped, of course, varies depending on what is specifically being valued. It's like Yeshua saying you can't serve Yahweh and Mammon. He's talking about two different value systems. You can't participate in both these value systems. You got to love God above all else. People are therefore always worshiping whether they realize it or not. The important question is, what are the specific core values that inform and characterize one's pattern of living? In other words, what is one's God? Unfortunately, this dynamic sense of worship usually succumbs to a more formal sense. Worship as stylized ritual behavior performed in sacred places on certain cultic occasions, making worship seem more special. Formal worship becomes a means for monitoring one's own piety as well as that of others, transforming religion into just another instrument of social control. Which, that part in the yellow, that's essentially what he was saying happened to the Sabbath command, where it became not a command about giving your workers and your animals a break every 7 days. It became a means of monitoring your own piety as well as that of others. How do you keep the Sabbath? When viewed in light of what we know about ancient patterns of thought, the connotations and significance of each covenant stipulation, when correctly translated, becomes dramatically different from the usual popular interpretation. So here's this phrase: "You have no other gods before me." In his treaty with Dupi Teshub, Marcellus says, "Do not turn your eyes to anyone else." Yeshua echoes this in the New Testament: "No one can serve two masters." To reject Yahweh is to enter into a conflicting covenant with someone or something else. To reject all Yahweh's commitments and obligations altogether. Turning to other gods means embracing alternative values and commitments, thus threatening the community by rejecting the ethical bond that holds it together. To place other gods ahead of Yahweh is to legitimize value systems rivaling that of the Decalogue, substituting another value system that may, for example, be less tolerant of cultural differences or encourage one's group domination of another. It has nothing to do with participating in the rituals of wrong determination. This is how, in a sense, this is how this understanding of God's justice plays into all this, because there is a tendency among people today to disregard God's justice, and they say things like, well, God He loves everyone, and He's not going to judge anyone. We're going to, we're all going to make mistakes. We're like little children, and so God is not going to hold us to any of these commandments or commitments that He made to us. And first of all, that goes directly against multiple statements from Yeshua about the wicked or the disobedient being cast out. But God's justice is embodied within the Decalogue. And so when you say that God is not going to judge people, He's not going to execute His justice, that is, in a sense, creating this new God. And so you're rejecting His value system for this new value system. So you've created this new God in your mind, this God that doesn't judge, this God that doesn't have a standard of righteousness. You've removed the holiness and the justice from God Himself and created this new entity that you're serving in lawlessness. And this is what we saw happening with Paul. It's what he did. He created this new lawless God, and many people today are doing that. You go into these churches that embrace things like homosexuality, and they have this, pastor up front wearing rainbow colors and all this kind of stuff, and they call themselves inclusive. They're worshiping a totally different God. It doesn't matter if they call their church Methodist or Baptist or whatever. They're not Christian. They're worshiping a different God. They're worshiping, like, Yeshua would never call Himself the son of that God, this lawless God that people have created. So in doing so, in embracing that type of understanding, you are essentially rejecting Yahweh the Creator. It's a new value system. You're serving a new master. Next, you will not make for yourself an idol. You will not bow down to them or serve them. This stipulation makes perfect sense when viewed in the context of the end of the Late Bronze Age, when all political power structures were discredited and in ruins. Monumental art and statuary typically had commissioned to cast an aura of sacredness around the official political organizations and to therefore sanctify political or particular socioeconomic agendas. Graven images of gods were symbols of power structures and interest groups. To bow down to them would be to ascribe value or worthship to that which they represent, the old ways of political domination and social control by coercion. In a previous video, we compared this to these statues of Baal, which represented power, as being the same idea or the same concept as a lot of these signs that we see out today that have that clenched fist. Usually these are more of a communist-minded groups, but the clenched fist is used as a symbol of power. You could ascribe that clenched fist to being a symbol of Baal, which Baal was personified power. So when you see these Judeo-communist organizations with the clenched fist, you could correctly ascribe that as Baal worship. Because remember, we all worship through our actions, whether we realize it or not. At the same time, it was forbidden to make an image of Yahweh that, given the context, surely meant transforming Yahweh into just another divine patron, symbolizing and promoting a particular social group or political agenda. The Sinai covenant forbids imaging or imagining Yahweh in such a social-political terms. Political authority and coercion in some contexts may be legitimate, but they cannot be sacred. In other words, viewed as the supreme arbiter of good and evil, a point that the Christian martyrs have given their lives to affirm. We talked about the idea of a divine patron earlier in a previous video, where Jeremiah was speaking against the priests. The priests were saying that that God was not going to destroy Jerusalem because his temple was there. And Jeremiah was saying, they're lying to you when they say the temple of Yah, the temple of Yah, the temple of Yah. If you don't practice righteousness and justice, God will indeed destroy this city. The people had come to think of God as this divine patron rather than this this entity that they were in covenant with and that they had commitments to keep to him. They had taken his commitments and turned it into a religious dogma, essentially. You will not make wrongful use of the name of Yahweh your God. In other words, you will not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain. In its ancient setting, this had nothing to do with foul language or obscene words, but with legal acts and what it meant to swear an oath, either to the truth of a statement when rendering testimony in a dispute, or to the reliability of a promise when drafting a contract with someone. I made the point in previous videos myself that, taking the name of Yahweh, like when you get married, you take the name of your spouse. And so taking the name of Yahweh in vain would be agreeing to a covenant with him, but then not keeping the things that he commanded, not rejecting his value system. Which, back to the example of these rainbow churches, that's what they're doing. They're claiming a commitment, a value system. They're claiming commitment to this covenant, but they're rejecting the value system embraced in the covenant. So, in that sense, they're taking his name in vain. They're claiming to have this covenant with him, but they're not keeping the covenant. It's no different than getting married and your wife takes your name, but then she refuses to act as a wife to you. She works outside of the covenant that you made with her. She's taken your name in vain. Among the diverse mix of people at Sinai, it was essential to know that someone's sworn word was his or her bond. It was an extremely serious matter formally and deliberately to invoke the name Yahweh. You shall not swear an oath by Yahweh to something if you are insincere or know it to be false. Any invocation of the name Yahweh to advance or promote something incompatible with Yahwism is a serious breach of covenant faith. It is taking the name in vain, i.e. wrongly. So you can, of course, refer to Matthew 5, verses 34 through 37, where the condensed version is Yeshua saying, "But I tell you, don't swear at all, but let your yes be yes and your no be no. Whatever is more of than these is of the evil one." This is such a serious matter to him that he recommends you don't swear at all, because of the penalty you will incur if you swear an oath to God and then break that oath or break that covenant. It's a serious matter. So again, that's Matthew 5, 34 through 37, if you want to read the entire quote. To remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy. Of all the covenant stipulations, this one initially seems to lack much moral profundity or cross-cultural value. But the Sabbath, the Hebrew Shabbat, has a long and complex history. Ancient Mesopotamian texts refer to the 15th day of the month as Shabbaton, which one text identifies as a day of resting of the heart. And I can tell you that if you look at the calendar of Babylon, the calendar of Babylon has Sabbaths on it. So, in fact, they were every 7 days of the moon. So, like the lunar Sabbath theory that some people still to this day promote, what they're promoting is the ancient Babylonian calendar. It's not a scriptural calendar. In fact, you can do a Google search for the ancient Babylonian calendar or ancient Babylonian lunar calendar, and it'll come up, and it's exactly the lunar Sabbath calendar that people are trying to promote. Sabbaths were a cultural norm in the ancient Near East. So where did I leave off? In farm villages, a day of rest for farmers and animals is widely recognized and highly advisable to prevent injury to overworked draft animals, and I would say, or people, especially during the plowing season. Originally, the Sabbath, Shabbat, Shabbaton, was a humanitarian institution for the well-being of laborers and working animals, and as such, would have been especially meaningful to a group of people only recently escaped from servitude. Understood in this context, it is called in its cross-cultural application is obvious. In time, the Sabbath would lose its cross-cultural significance and become something more parochial, a holy day whose proper rituals marked membership in one particular culture, in this case, Judaism. It became so important that the later author of Genesis' creation story depicted everything being created in 6 days so that God too could properly observe the Sabbath. Ironically, Sabbath observance became a bitterly divisive issue within Judaism and later Christianity as different sects bickered over who observed it most properly. Viewed as a command, this stipulation expects, if not demands, that people adjust their lives around the observance of ritual ceremonies, a notion that Jesus criticized in Matthew 2:27. That's where he says to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." The history of Sabbath observance is a classic example of the law of functional shift, where religious form is preserved long after its original function has been lost and replaced by another. In fact, it's kind of funny that he refers to this Mark 2:27 because that when it's one of the verses I began to notice that stood out to me, and I was like, this seems to indicate to me that we had the wrong idea about Sabbath. And so, independent of Professor Mendenhall's books, before I'd even read this book, I began to notice this pattern that it seemed like Sabbath was meant more to be a day of rest and a day of our own enjoyment rather than a day of us, sticking to this strict list of do's and don'ts. And that a lot of these commandments about Sabbaths were added after the fact. That was the conclusion I came to, and he seems to have a remarkably similar vision of this or understanding of this as I did, as I still do. That it's just about taking a day off, spending time with your family, spending time in prayer with God, that sort of thing. It's a good day to do Bible study and those things. But some of these other commands, these burdensome commands, like that's just all been added after the fact. The Sabbath was made to be a gift for you, something you enjoy, not something that adds more stress to your life because you have all these rules and all these boxes to jump through. Honor your father and mother. It is curious that this command presented as an interest of Yahweh, especially since adages are commonly used everywhere socially to control children. At the same time, like all the other obligations, this is addressed not to youngsters but to adults, presumably with elderly parents. We know far too little about family relationships in the late Bronze Age to know whether this command sought to rectify disturbing patterns of parental neglect that accompany social disintegration. The family has been the primary economic unit throughout history, and because its survival is based as much on economic interest as personal attachments, the elderly are sometimes vulnerable to neglect. I would even go so far as to say it's about honoring not just your mother and father, but your ancestors too. So, if your ancestors, if your mother, your grandmother and grandfather, and if these people were devout believers in Yahweh, served and worshipped Yeshua, and then you turn to this life of sin and debauchery, you're dishonoring those people. You're dishonoring those people who gave life to you. I would even include that sort of concept of dishonoring your parents or dishonoring your ancestors. Doesn't mean you worship your ancestors. That's a totally different thing. But you want to honor them. You want to live your life in a way that's honorable to them. I would insert that understanding of this verse also. You will not kill, you will not commit adultery, you will not steal, you will not bear false witness against your neighbor. Murder, adultery, false theft, and lying about another person whose well-being is at stake were prohibited in all ancient law. But this is not law, because these rather terse stipulations, despite their straightforward language, lack the precision and specificity required of legal injunctions. So in other words, these are not, the language used is vague. It's not a specific type of adultery or a specific type of theft. It's very vague language so that it covers a wide range of actions. So it seeks to, again, it's about concepts or value systems. It's not about a specific type of killing or specific type of adultery or a specific type of stealing. If it was an actual legal injunction like statutory law is very specific, and so there's different penalties for different types of theft, for instance. Consequently, they are inadequate as bases of externally enforced social control because they do not address, much less command or prohibit, specific acts. The key Hebrew terms for these four prohibitions, ratzah, na'af, ganab, and ana shakar, are in many respects more general and elastic than would seem from our various English translations. For example, the Hebrew ratzah does not refer to the legal concept of murder, despite the misleading NRSV translation. In fact, I would say ratzah is actually used in Isaiah 1:21 and Hosea 6:9 with regards to the priests murdering animals for sacrifice. So it's not just about murder, it's about killing in general. Early translations would say, "Thou shalt not kill," and that's been changed in more recent translations to "Thou shalt not murder." At any time a human life is taken through agency of a private individual, regardless of whether the law would classify it as murder, manslaughter, depraved indifference to human life, or even accidental homicide, the religious obligation to Yahweh has been violated. And I would say that does not necessarily mean human life. It's any type of killing. Referring back to Isaiah 21 or 121 and Hosea 6:9, it just does not specifically only include the killing of a human. This means that whether a human life is taken by another human being, the religious community must insist that religion not be used to sanction, excuse, or gloss over the death. Regardless of the extent of the legal guilt or innocence of the killer, religious guilt existed in all cases except those where a person's accidental death was regarded as an act of God. Note that since the Decalogue is addressed to individuals, in other words, you, singular, thou, and not to corporate bodies such as governments, it would be improper to use the passage to prohibit the government from exercising legitimate functions of waging war and punishing criminals. So, in other words, you couldn't really use this necessarily to say that, well, you can't execute a murderer, because that's a different matter. The Ten Commandments is being addressed to individuals, not killing each other. In the Sermon on the Mount, Yeshua recognized that such elastic terms have broad implications, criticizing those who sought to reduce them to precise legal definitions while creating convenient loopholes along the way. So that's why in the Ten Commandments the terms are so broad, is because it keeps you from being able to claim a loophole. But then when you start putting these precise commandments in and inserting all this, what we referred to earlier as case law, then it gives you room to be able to claim exemptions or loopholes to certain commands. Yeshua said that whoever harbors ill will toward his brother is guilty under God of destroying human life as someone who bludgeons another person to death, and that whoever relates to a woman in any way on the basis of improper lust is as guilty under God of sexual impropriety as a man who actually has illicit sexual intercourse with her. Such elastic terms as ratzah and na'at provide no useful basis for socially enforced sanction because the prohibited actions are not clearly specified. In other words, they're very vague. They cover a wide range of types of murder or theft or whatever. Consequently, persons with integrity are committed to avoiding all these things and therefore are under obligation not even to start down a path leading to these directions. If they do, they are accountable to God. It would seem from this that Jesus was not innovatively reframing Old Testament law, but simply recognizing the built-in flexibility of the covenant commitments. Like the Sermon on the Mount, these statements are part of a personal ethic whose enforcement has not been delegated publicly or socially to any human judges or juries. Because these obligations were intended to define the core of human integrity, deviation from them was a private matter of conscience between God and the individual. Putting human life in jeopardy, sexual impropriety, taking things that do not belong to you, and distorting the truth are always wrong, regardless of whether the culprit is hauled into a court of law to answer to the community. Individuals who stand in covenant with Yahweh are constantly responsible, much more so than if their actions were merely accountable to the law. This insight alone accounts for the overwhelmingly moralistic tone of the Bible. So we'll read that part in yellow again. Individuals who stand in covenant with Yahweh are constantly responsible, much more so than if their actions were merely accountable to law. People tend to think that Yahweh is much more lenient than human legal systems, but in reality, he's much more, I would say much more stern or much more demanding of justice. So understanding the justice of God means that you understand that aspect of him. You don't downplay the obedience to him. You understand that you have even a higher commitment to him than you do to human law. Concerns of the general population's morality eventually migrate from the realm of the private, such as the individual's conscience, to the public, community-enforced legal sanctions. The Bible contains numerous such legal codes in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, all from later times, in which social sanctions were extrapolated from the religious ethic expressed in the Decalogue. So that's the case law. These numerous legal codes in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, that was all stuff that came later that was inserted into the Bible as a type of like codifying decisions that had been made within the community. When the personal and voluntary commitments of private individuals to the religious ethic fail to inspire a minimum level of tolerable behavior, society becomes increasingly tempted to establish a legal monopoly of force or human government with legislatures and judges. But by this they hope to establish and enforce laws regulating behavior, thereby helping to guarantee public order through fear and tangible penalties. So in other words, the more corrupt the society is, the more numerous are its laws. Which is a quote from the Roman historian Tacitus. If a value system nurturing human integrity and rejecting self-centeredness loses its popular appeal, then it must be succeeded either by the political exercise of legal force or by the violence of anarchy. This also seems to be the point of Jesus' remark that biblical laws, usually attributed to God, were actually written to accommodate human, quote, hard-heartedness, which equals a lack of covenant integrity. At best, they are divine concessions made because people who are no longer willing to do what is right out of a sense of ethical obligations will do so out of a fear of social sanctions. And I think that understanding this, what is being said here, it actually gives you a better understanding of what is being said by Yeshua when he speaks about Moses gave you the command for divorce because of your hard-heartedness, meaning lack of covenant integrity. In other words, a marriage is a covenant, and if you have no covenant integrity, then there has to be a law to dissolve that covenant, because it's not fair to the other party. For the covenant between two parties, one party is abiding by the covenant, one party is not. That hard-heartedness applies to that person who is not abiding by the covenant, which is, this whole statement was made by Yeshua in response to this question of whether you can divorce someone for any reason whatsoever. And Yeshua says, no, you need to have a reason. You need to have cause. So the cause would be that other person, the person who is being divorced, has a lack of covenant integrity. And yes, that could include adultery, but there's other ways that someone could have a lack of covenant integrity. And so I'm not going to go through every definition of what that could be, but I've got a video that I made years ago, like one of the very first videos I made about what the Bible says about divorce and remarriage. You can find it. It's still on my my YouTube channel. You can look it up if you want to, but it falls perfectly in line with what's being said here. The other laws, which yes, they are usually attributed to God, they were written to accommodate hard-heartedness. That's why the Torah is so long, is because of all these additional laws that have been inserted. And it's all to ensure that people stick to these commitments, these 10 commitments and the 10 commandments. You will not covet your neighbor's house. The final proof that the Decalogue was not intended as a basis of community enforced law or commandment is the commitment to not covet. In other words, not to want something belonging to someone else. Clearly, obligations to Yahweh encompass not only objective behaviors that human witnesses can observe and testify to, but also inner attitudes. No law court could possibly enforce this stipulation, because no witness can credibly testify that another person is desiring something. Like the other 9 commitments, this is an obligation to Yahweh, not to the society per se. Its intent was not to control human behavior through socially enforced rules, but to define personal character and integrity. So now we go back to the treaty structure. We got through the first 3 elements. Now we're up to the 4th, which is list of witnesses. Even though overlords were militarily much stronger than their vassals, the treaty itself would never be so crass as to suggest that their relationship was actually established upon intimidation and threats of military reprisal. Because the treaty as a covenant was an oath, it was the gods who were expected to punish any violation. The Hittite treaties invoked by name every imaginable god, the overlords as well as the vassals, to underwrite the treaty. In other words, all religions were called on to uphold the sanctity of the promise the vassal was about to make. The sanctity of a promise is nothing less than the sanctity of human integrity, and any religion promoting that was acceptable to the Hittite state. Various natural phenomena were also invoked: mountains, rivers, streams, the great sea, heaven and earth, the winds and the clouds. Let these be witnesses to this treaty and this oath. The Hebrews, of course, could not imagine other discredited gods witnessing the covenant with Yahweh. But later prophetic tradition poetically expressed the curious notion that nature, as an agent of God, was a witness to the covenant, which could be summoned to indict Israel for breach of covenant. The biblical idea that creation itself had a stake in human integrity apparently goes back to these ancient treaties, and this is actually reinforced in the Nazarene Acts. Peter says that when we don't keep this covenant with Yahweh, nature itself rises up against us. That is not even God in instituting the punishments on us. It is the creation itself that does it. It's like the creation rejects us because we reject the covenant with its creator. In the biblical account of the later covenant ceremony at Shechem, Joshua tells the Israelites, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen Yahweh to serve him." The Israelites reply, "We are witnesses," in Joshua 24:22. Instead of nature or some supernatural power enforcing compliance, the community itself has become the witness. Adherence to the covenant is to be self-policing. Curses and blessings. The treaties conclude with a list of the benefits and punishments that the gods will bestow or inflict on the vassal, depending on his compliance with the stipulations. Failing to fulfill one's commitments to one's overlord has dire consequences. Death, disease, crop failure, and defeat in war were prominently listed among the curses, the ultimate curse being the complete destruction and scattering of the body politic. The blessings of the gods included long life, peace, prosperity. Lists of curses and blessings were appended to several later texts in the Bible, reminding the Israelites of the solemn nature of their obligation to Yahweh. See Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. The biblical tradition also recalls that ceremonial renewals of Yahweh's covenant with Israel included a recitation of curses and blessings. See Deuteronomy 27, 11 through 26, Joshua 8, 30 through 35, and especially verse 34 in Joshua 8. Whoop. Finally, there's the oath of compliance. A treaty is a text, but an oath is the actual mechanism whereby the text is ratified and brought to life. You know, in a marriage covenant, it's, of course, the vows themselves. You say the vows to each other. No longer just words in a document, but a function in reality in the lives of actual people. We have ample evidence of treaties concluding with rituals of compliance, usually spoken oaths, but sometimes physical gestures. In much the same way that treaties today are ratified by signatures and handshakes activating the new relationship and its terms. It should not be surprising that the biblical story of the covenant at Mount Sinai reaches its climax with the escaped slaves pledging to abide by the covenant obligations, thereby defining and activating themselves as people of Yahweh. With this ceremony, the covenant took effect. A treaty from that in centuries past had been the basis for the relationships between political states and other social groups. Now became the basis for a religious community born in the wilderness of Sinai. For those assembled there, an image or metaphor that originally functioned in the context of political governance came to function in the context of religious accountability. They too now had an overlord, a king, whose government bound them together. And of course that overlord was Yahweh himself. For these, the first devotees of Yahweh, religion supported the unprecedented claim that human community is actually not dependent ultimately on commandments or other organizational, coercive, special forces or inducements of social prestige, but on people's commitments to integrity and personal character. From this, it follows that no religion claiming Moses and the Exodus as part of its heritage can be used to sanction social control interests. Such interests must stand or fail on their own. Instead, in this formative period, the roles of Yahwism was to promote the fundamental values that cultivate across cultures the sort of personal character and integrity desired by Yahweh, because that is ultimately the true and only foundation of human community. The Sinai covenant provided a basis for community to re-emerge from the ash heaps of civilization-wide destruction. The centuries that followed brought rapid and exceedingly far-reaching changes to this particular community, now regarding itself as the people of Yahweh. In fact, the attempt to preserve the values and commitments of its formative period in changing historical and social context eventually resulted in the production of all sorts of Israelite religious literature, some of which was later collected for inclusion in that body of sacred scripture today called the Bible. About half of that later literature is history writing. The need to present the faith to later generations and to new circumstances induced many ancient scribes to revise the picture of Israel's formative period. For example, fictitiously depicting Yahweh leading an entire nation of ethnically homogeneous people out of Egypt. That is why critical readers of the Bible cannot and should not take its historical reporting at face value, but the image of Moses up on Mount Sinai to receive the Decalogue, the centerpiece of Yahweh's faith, remained a powerful image for later Israelite storytellers. And when some of them would later be tempted to add something new to the centerpiece of the faith, they could revise the Sinai story, portraying Moses taking yet another trip up the mountain to receive some authoritative new directive, making the faith more relevant. This helps explain the curious fact that in the Bible, Moses makes repeated trips up Mount Sinai. I would also say that in the same way that these Israelite scribes made changes to the formative period described in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy, you see the same thing with Christian scribes. The changes and the alterations to the New Testament scriptures that have taken place over time. And even in modern times, that's usually done by retranslating verses in ways that better fit the established religious system. And we've spoken about a lot of those, like translating the word that should be translated as obey, translating it as believe, so that Jesus' message is changed from one of obedience to one of simply belief alone. Before we conclude, we're going to look at these various trips that Moses took up Mount Sinai. Between Exodus 19:3 and 34:29, Moses makes perhaps 8 or 9 trips up Mount Sinai to meet Yahweh. But the story is so garbled that it's impossible to say how many times he went up or even why. Some verses describing Moses' ascent do not seem to have a corresponding reference to his descent. And sometimes an account of an ascent may simply elaborate on a previous one, creating the impression that he went up twice when he really only went up once. If nothing else, this confusion discounts the theory that all this is the simple work of creative writers inventing a coherent story. It seems better to assume that the tradition of Moses ascending Mount Sinai was constantly being modified by later scribes trying to piggyback onto something they considered important. The confusion results from attempts to preserve in the book of Exodus all these traditions, the original one about the Decalogue, and all the later revisions. So in other words, every time Moses went back up the mountain, that was a later scribe attempting to insert his own religious dogma into the text to give it validity through the actions of Moses. In almost all cases, we cannot determine when and why the later traditions arose. For example, the tradition of Aaron, the prototypical Yahwist priest accompanying Moses up Sinai, might have arisen among later Israelites who wanted to confer legitimacy on the priestly family administering the Yahwist shrine at Shiloh. The tradition of Moses, joined by Aaron's sons, and the 70 elders, receiving specifications for the Ark of the Covenant. Trip number 3, may have arisen at the time of David to sanctify the Ark that David brought into Jerusalem in 2 Samuel chapter 6. Perhaps the clearest revision is the giving of the so-called ritual dialogue on trip number 5, the tradition that ritual commandments were given at Sinai to supersede the ethical ones. They likely arose during the reign of Solomon, when the Old Covenant and his tribal federation had been superseded by the Davidic covenant and the Solomonic kingdom. And he's going to discuss that later in this book. By piggybacking onto the Sinai tradition, Yahweh is shown as giving divine approval to the reduction of religion to mere ritual, which is in fact what happened during Solomon's reign. And it is also in fact something that the later prophets consistently and constantly refuted, that Yahweh's religion was about ritual. It wasn't. It's about justice and righteousness. Even though some degree of literary license was performed, it is worth noting that no scribe felt comfortable depicting Moses making a trip up the mountain with a representative of the tribe of Benjamin or Judah to receive anything like a divine charter authorizing some human king to be named in the future. The tradition was simply too insistent that Saul had been installed at the behest of Samuel, and that David had received his divine right to rule from Nathan, who may have been the court prophet from the Jebusite regime in Jerusalem that preceded David. Apparently, Israelite culture has some constraints preventing Israelite kingship from being linked to Moses. And so if you want to study out this whole issue of Moses' trips up the mountain, there's a chart on page 71 of the book detailing Moses' trips up the mountain. Like I said, there's a link in the description where you can download the PDF for free, and if you want to look at that chart and look up the scriptures and verify it for yourself, you can. But anyway, that's it for now. Thank you for listening. I pray that this has given you a few things to think about and consider, and we'll pick it up again next time. Thank you. Shalom.